Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays at the Museum. I'm Amanda Harrison, a Community Engagement Manager with the DIA. And yes, you're in the right place. Thursdays at the Museum has moved to YouTube. We hope that this transition made for an easier login experience and for a more enjoyable broadcast overall. On YouTube, there's no need to be logged in unless you'd like to ask a question. And we want to encourage you to please participate. If you're logged into a Gmail account already, you may automatically be signed into YouTube. If you don't, you can find a blue login button at the top of your screen on the right-hand side. Click Sign In. This will take you to the Gmail sign-in page. Use your Gmail email and password to sign in, or choose the Create Account button below if you'd like to create a new account. Once you're signed in, under the video screen, you will see an Add Public Comment prompt. Use this to ask your question during the live event. Christine Mark, the Manager of Volunteer Development, will be reading your questions on screen. To make the event appear full screen, select the small square on the bottom right side of the video. These options only appear if you hover your mouse over them. In this menu, you can also choose to turn on closed captioning by selecting the CC icon. Today, we have docent chairs Howard Rosenberg and Ray Henri here to talk about Ashcan art. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you, Amanda.
It's good to see everybody today. We're glad to be back. I'm happy to be with my friend and colleague, Ray Henri. So let's get started. Ray, take it away.
Thanks so much, Howard. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be presenting with you. So today is a new tour that has not been, this is, I guess, the premiere, Howard, of a new tour concerning what's called Ashcan works. Specifically, we're dealing with Ashcan works in the DIA. So Howard, in the late 19th and early 20th century, America was dramatically changing. It was becoming an industrial power. Industry and manufacturing had greatly increased, and the machines and products being produced transformed the pace and character of daily life and the American identity. Cities grew due to the wealth and businesses created by industry and the progress of building technology. Increased populations due to the industry and immigration radically altered urban life. Now, this photo and the next photo, next slide please, are from the DIA's collection. This dynamic time also produced difficult working conditions, crowded and challenging living environments, and ethnic neighborhoods. It created tremendous wealth and a class of the rich who like to show off their affluence. Next slide, please. Oh, Howard, there's you and your wife. However, traditional academic concepts of subject matter, beauty, and technique dominated the American art world, particularly the conservative taste of the National Academy of Design located in New York. A leading artist of the National Academy created this particular work, and next slide, please, and this other work. And these were leading figures in the National Academy. Our tour today concerns a group of American artists led by Robert Henri, who moved away from these traditional styles of painting. These artists originally came together in Philadelphia in the late 1890s and moved away from these traditional styles of painting through their thought process about how art should be. And they gained momentum in 1904 when Henri led them to New York, and they started cooperating with other artists in the New York art scene, and they started to create works, what they called a new form of realism. Next slide.
Ray, did you ever have to sit in a corner with one of those hats when you were in school?
You know, I'm thinking that maybe when we get back to the museum volunteering, that should be out what the docents are wearing. What do you think?
It could say, ask me a question.
Next slide, please. Thanks so much. So this is pictures of some of these artists. So this movement, the movement's subject matter was to be more oriented toward urban life and traditional taste of highly idolized subjects. And the movement's style would be in an impressionist style with broad brush paint. And the movement's goal was to obtain a more dynamic image of America, capturing partial and real truths of the complexity of life and the diversity of city living. They wanted to capture the real, the ugly, and the beautiful of 20th century urban life. In 1908, Henri led these artists, which we're featuring today, to display their paintings at the Macbeth Gallery in protest of those traditional styles of the National Academy of Design. The group was dubbed the Eight. Years later, several of the eight artists became known as Ashcan painters because of their preference for depicting the steamier side of urban life. Next slide, please. So here's a photo of Ashcan painters. But they weren't called that during the time of the movement. Art historians Helga Cahill and Alfred Barr gave the name Ashcan to the movement in 1934 in a book that they wrote called Art in America. They framed the movement as existing for a 20-year period from 1897 through 1917, and they adopted the term Ashcan from a critic from a socialist publication called The Masses. In 1916, that critic condemned John Sloan and other artists who were more interested in painting art than political commentary.
So they were trashing the artist, all right?
This is the quote of the critic. They wanted to run pictures of ash cans and girls hitching up their skirts on Horatio Street, regardless of ideas and without title. End of quote. Next slide. Thanks. So the DIA has an extraordinary collection of these paintings, only some of which we are going to cover today. And this collection is in large parts thanks to the fellow whose portrait we're showing here, Clyde Bellows. At the turn of the 20th century, Mr. Bellows was the assistant director of the DIA, and he became the first curator of American art. Bellows recognized the genius of these artists, and despite the tepid critical reaction, he began to accumulate the art through networking, through patrons, through art dealers, and through the artists themselves. In fact, many of the works he purchased directly from the artist. In a 1917 DIA bulletin, Bellows praised these artists. He said, quote, "They hold up a mirror to our time in our way of living. They express something of the engaging whirlwind of American life, which sweeps away the things of one decade only to replace them with new wonders." End of quote. Bellows understood that these works of these artists captured the everyday, but with spectacular and extraordinary execution. They were both common and beautiful. Howard?
Great introduction, Ray. Really good job. And here's a guy who is responsible for this whole thing. Robert Henri. That's how he wanted his name pronounced. Henri. And this is his photograph. This is courtesy of the American Art Museum. This is not one of our pieces. Robert Henri was born on September 27th. I'm sorry, he was born on June 24th, 1865, and he died on July 12th, 1929. He actually was born in Cincinnati, but he moved to Cozad, Nebraska soon after he was born and grew up there for a while. Now, Cozad, Nebraska is a small town currently off of Interstate 80 that Henri's grandfather founded. And it's not clear to me why his family moved them back to Cozad while they were living in Cincinnati. But while in Cozad, and Robert Henri's real name was Robert Cozad, and he changed it to Robert Cozad, actually Robert Henri, then we're now recognizing him as Robert Cozad Henri, is because his father in Cozad, Nebraska, got into a tiff with another person and wound up in a fight, and the other person died. So they had to leave town quickly. The family fled. Everybody changed their name. Robert changed his name to Henri. He eventually wound up at art school. He traveled to Europe. He then became an art teacher. He was actually on the American Academy of Design, the academy that he revolted against. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here is a picture that I get credit for. And I get credit for it because I took it. And it's from the Robert Henri Museum and Art Gallery in Cozad, Nebraska. I just happened to be driving along I-80 one day when my wife and I were on an RV trip this past summer, something we did because of the pandemic. And we saw a sign that said Henri Museum. So we just pulled off, and there it was. We met the director. We got a detailed look at all his pieces. And when you see a ton of his pieces, altogether, you can really see how he loved to paint, his style of painting, and particularly how he liked to paint children. So let's go to our first piece. And our first piece is called The Beach Hat. And The Beach Hat is a portrait which Henri specialized in. It's done in an impressionist style, but he really liked using these quick, fast brushstrokes. Henri worked fast. He could do a portrait in an hour and get an accurate representation, but he used quick, fast brushstrokes. And in the beginning of his work, he was deeply influenced by Velázquez and by Frans Hals and Manet, and he loved using dark tones, especially in the backgrounds. So why am I showing you this? Is it's just the opposite of that. Because in 1914, he was invited to go out west, and he wound up going to California for a time. And he talked about the sun. And artists, you know, we talked about Monet for a long time, and he and his other impressionists buddies would go out and just look at the sun. They'd look at the air. They'd look at the color of the sky. And so to him, light and color were so important that the sun in California was so different, so bright, so impressive that he felt, you know, he felt compelled to change what he did. And so he painted the sun behind his wife. That's essentially what he's saying. You're looking at the California sun sky in Southern California behind his wife. And when you're down at the museum, which is open, need reservations, wear a mask, you can see this piece. It's really gorgeous. Now let's go to the next piece.
Wait, before you do, Howard, can you go back?
Yeah.
That is an extraordinary piece when you see it in person. And what I like about it is the hat really isn't just a hat. It really puts together the whole portrait, you know, composition-wise. It's almost expressive. I really think it's a wonderful painting. Thanks, Howard.
Okay. Now, Boy with Plaid Scarf. He's back to his dark background. He's back to his quick, fast brushstrokes. He actually was a guy that began the art colonies in New Mexico. After he was there for months, people would start to come because of the weather, because of the scenery. And he loved to paint all sorts of children from diverse backgrounds. And what would happen is his wife, who you just saw, would play the piano for the child to keep him entertained. The child would only have to sit comfortably for about an hour while Henri got his portrait done, and then they'd pay him 25 cents. So he paid his model. He took care of his model too. And in 1908, as Ray was saying, he organized this group of artists that, I thought I had that turned off. He organized this group of artists that became known as the Eight. They were not happy that the Academy of Design required them to submit their paintings to a jury. And the jury had made a decision that what was appropriate to go in. And as we'll talk about later, Henri said, anything is the subject for a painting. Anything you want to paint, you can paint. You don't have to listen to the jury. So that's where, that's where they went. Are there any questions about Henri's pieces?
There is a question, Howard. You
Sure.
mentioned that he was a very quick painter and he could knock off a painting in even as little as an hour.
Yeah.
How long did it take, for instance, some of these other painters we're going to be talking about? How long would it take them to create a portrait?
You're going to see a painting by George Lutz of three men holding instruments, and that painting took about 4 hours. So there's a difference, in the biography of Leonardo da Vinci, they write that the Mona Lisa was found in his studio after 16 years and he was still working on it. So some people take a really long time to do things. The old masters take days and days and hours to glaze their paintings or add another touch. As we know, Diego Rivera did his mural in our industry court in 9 months. So it all depends. Some artists work really fast and others take months to do theirs. And what we're going to be talking about are fast illustrators, newspaper men that were also illustrators that then became artists and were trained by Henri or John Sloan that worked quickly because they had to capture images fast.
Okay, how about Boy with Plaid Scarf? You mentioned that this young man was paid 25 cents for an hour. Did Henri finish this painting in an hour?
Let's go back to the photographs. The director of the museum was telling us when we were there that all these photos he painted in an hour's time. So I can't say that the Boy with Plaid was painted in an hour's time because we weren't looking at it at that time. But these photographs, the young girl and everybody else, he did that, and it was a complete painting done in an hour. If you've ever taken a painting class, there's quick sketches and fast models. You could do a painting like this in an hour. If you know what you're doing, if you can capture an image quickly, it's possible to complete something like this in an hour's time. Most painters and go back to the Boy with Plaid Scarf, my guess is most painters would take about 3-4 hours to get something like that. Henri was remarkable at his ability to do this.
So it sounds like that was a skill he developed over time. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Okay, Ray.
Thanks, Howard. This is George Bellows. He was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1882, and he attended the Ohio State University. He played basketball and baseball there, and actually he was also a talented artist, and he contributed many drawings to the university's newspapers. He was so good at baseball that for 1 year he played semi-professional ball, but decided to give it up and pursue art. And in 1904, he moved to New York and attended the New York School of Art, where he studied under Robert Henri, who was teaching at the school. Bellows soon became Henri's protege and a close friend. Unfortunately, Bellows died at the age of 32 from complications caused by a ruptured appendix. He's best known for his choice of manly subject matter and his manly style of painting. Indeed, his most popular works focus on prize fighting. Next slide, please. So this is a stag at Sharkey's. This is from a famous series of lithographs and paintings that Bellows did. This isn't very big. It's only 22 inches tall and about 28 inches wide. It's based on a famous 1909 painting that Bellows did that currently resides at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is the painting. And the painting he did, Bellows, from memory. He went and saw the bout, and had a mental image that ended up being in his drawings and paintings. Bellows in 1906 moved to a building that was across the street from Sharkey's, and it was an interesting building because it had many soon-to-be famous people, including the very famous American playwright Eugene O'Neill. So Sharkey's was this private athletic club, and prize fighting was not permitted if you charged admission. It was considered illegal. But private clubs like this could have prize fighting and became a favorite venue for them. Next slide, please. So this is the lithograph. And Howard, doesn't it have like a smoky, dark, kind of a listed crowd space, in the ring? It sort of captures sort of an underworld type flavor, that was associated with prize fights.
Well, and you can see the power in the movement also.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting you mentioned that, Howard, because by the time he started to do these lithographs, they differed a bit from the painting. And part of the reason is he began to treat the human figures more simply and geometrically. And he experimented with composition in that way. And he called that formula for composition dynamic symmetry. And it's, you have these two powerful male bodies in this, in the midst of all these, these male figures, their faces look kind of demonic, and like they're calling for blood. But the subject matter is really fraught with drama and alludes to, more general concepts, sort of concepts that have been in art since prehistoric time: competition, battle, victory and defeat, physical power, intense engagement of two fighters or two warriors. Next slide, please. This is probably his most famous of his prize fight figures. This is called a knockout. This particular lithograph of the DIA collection is from 1921. It's created based upon a drawing that he had done 15 years earlier. And here you have this unruly audience members surging the ring while the referee's trying to restrain the fighter from injuring the fellow on the floor anymore. For some unknown reason, Howard, Bellows printed very few of these compositions, and it remains his rarest lithograph. And we're very fortunate to have it here. Next slide, please. This is an iconic Ashcan painting, and we're fortunate to have it in the DIA collection. It's called A Day in June from 1913. It's large. It's about 44 inches.
This is the same artist?
Same artist. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah.
And it's what's striking is, and you've seen this in the gallery, how this pops. Just absolutely pops when you go into the room. And it's considered, as I said, an iconic picture for Ashcan. And it won the Temple Gold Medal at the Pennsylvania Academy of Arts in 1917. And Clyde Barrows, the fellow I was mentioning before, was able to purchase it for the DIA directly from Bellows after much back and forth negotiation. In his article in the 1917 DIA Bulletin, Bellows highly praises this painting as being an excellent example of the movement of these artists who paint everyday subject matter, but it looks spontaneous, and unlike Henri with his portraits, these are actually very carefully planned. And so the subject matter here is a group of elegant New Yorkers enjoying a late afternoon outing in Central Park. It's an unusually idyllic scene for Ashcan artists, but it's meant to communicate the good life of the New York upper class or upper crust, sort of showing off their wealth, which was something that became more and more common as affluence from industry became more and more prevalent. Bellows conveys this sort of sense of motion with colors and figure shapes. And in the background, you have this sort of symbol of Americans, America in the 20th century. You've got a skyscraper. Bellows studied and adopted emerging color and design themes. The color theme he adopted was based upon a codification of visual harmonies and disharmonies in colors. like a chord in a piano. Some chords are pleasing, some are not. And so this was a set codification of what is pleasing harmonies and colors and what is displeasing. And the theory of design aligns to elements of composition based upon geometric grids of vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. In fact, Howard, there is indentations in the painting from Bellows inserting tacks in the canvas to create a grid. He put the tacks in, then he connected with string, and then he would do his underdrawing to have that kind of precision. But despite all this, he still creates a very harmonious composition that really beautifully elevates sort of an everyday scene.
Hey, Ray, you know how, and this is just my opinion, but it seems like his theory of color that he, read about and used was a lot like George Seurat. And this painting is just reminiscent of Le Grand Jeté, that Sunday afternoon. We don't have that. That's in Chicago. But it's just sort of like our American version of the Seurat's painting from Sunday afternoon in Paris.
Sure, which is he was a post-impressionist, and the impressionists were very much interested in the harmony and disharmony of colors and creating emotion.
Now, while this is not pointillist, it's an impression.
I understand your point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any questions, Christine?
No, the only question was you made the comparison between the Seurat and the Bellows in terms of the subject matter, but the painting styles are very different.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about? You said Bellows used color and geometry, but did he use his paint like Henri did, or was he more detailed in his paint use?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, you still have the sense of brush strokes, but and there's still the sense of spontaneity, but he was not a spontaneous painter. He was very carefully planned painter. And that's what Bellows was communicating in that 1917 bulletin, is that while it has this kind of sense, you can see the brush strokes and fluidity that you would associate maybe with impressionist style painting, his was extremely calculated. Every shape is extremely calculated. Every brush stroke is calculated. So it's a much different style of paint going about the painting, a much different technique, I should say, but it ends up with a bit of a similar style.
Okay, so these paintings have underdrawings. Is that what you're saying?
This one does. This one does.
And I imagine that would have taken him much longer than an hour.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I don't know how long this took, Christine, but I do know, based upon the DIA bulletin that the curator wrote, that it was very calculated. And actually, without going too deep into it, it was based upon prevailing themes about color and design that were quite sophisticated areas.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So Howard.
So Ray, if you want to talk about somebody who really used Ashcan and Rye style, you can talk about George Lukes. And so we're going to talk about two of his pieces right now. He was an illustrator and a newspaper man. He worked for the Philadelphia Press when he met Robert Henri and John Sloan. He began to paint in that style. He went to Philadelphia Art School. He learned those slashing strokes, the quick rendering, the dark backgrounds. He did go to Europe. He attended German and French art academies, and he learned to work quickly. He did. What's interesting is he showed his work at the Armory Show of 1913, a show organized by another Ashcan artist, another of the eight, whose work we're not going to see today. But the Armory Show in 1913 in New York was very famous because it introduced to America all the modern artists, Matisse, Picasso, Manet, Monet, all those people went to the Armory Show. And this was not a piece that was in there, but he did exhibit. I'm not sure what piece was in there. So let's look at this piece. It's called Woman with Macaws. So you have a brightly colored macaw in front as the foreground. You have a woman way in the background, way deep, leaning on her side, just kind of staring, interesting at the bird. Characteristic of Ashcan painters is they like to use models, street types, urchins, beggars, entertainers, working people, people in less fortunate situations. And Luke's commonly used macaws, birds. He liked their brightness. He liked what the image that they brought to the screen. And so this painting is not sentimental. It's not romantic. It's just showing you a scene from, from everyday life, a woman hanging out with her bird. Now, the next painting has an interesting story. When I talked about the painting being done in 4 hours, this is the painting that I was referring to. These three sergeants from 1925 were all students of George Luke's, and they all lived in the same apartment building, and they came to visit him one night. And while they were talking, he had this idea of painting them as a group. And we know that because the singer depicting holding a book is Walter Vandenberg. The guitarist is Cy King, and the flautist is named, they called him Burley. That's all we know about him. Vandenberg wrote in his diary about this. He wrote that these three men were his art students, that they were being taught in New York at the time, that they came to New York one evening, and he had this idea. So he gave Vandenberg an art magazine and told him to look like you're singing out in a hymnal. And then he gave Burley the guitar, and he gave Cy King the flute, and he said, "You guys are a band." And in 4 hours, one evening, he did everything you're seeing except for the guitar strings, which he did the next morning. And get this, Ray's going to tell you the rest of the story. What happened then, Ray?
So Clyde Bellows was with an art dealer, and they had actually spent quite a long evening, and the art dealer actually brought them into the studio, Luke's studio, and this painting was still wet, and Bellows liked it so much that he bought it there. He bought it before the paint was dry.
Isn't that something? He bought it with the paint not even dry yet. I mean, it sometimes, depending on how thick it is, could take months or a year for a piece to be ready to be hung or finished varnished. Unfortunately, Ray, this story doesn't have a happy ending. Now, while we have lucky enough to have this piece, which Luke said was the best piece he ever made, which I'm not sure if he said it because he was trying to jack up the price or whether he really believed it, but he did say that. And he was very charismatic, but he was also volatile, unpredictable, and he drank to excess. And when he was 66 years old, one night he was found dead as a result of a bar brawl where he was beaten and killed. So unfortunately, he came to an unhappy ending. Are there any questions?
I actually don't have any questions. I have an exclamation of, wow, that's quite a story.
Yes,
It is quite a story.
It's quite a story. All right, Ray.
Oh, I am so happy I get to talk about John Sloan, because
All Ray's been doing for weeks is saying, I get to talk about John Sloan.
there's a little bit of truth to that.
Okay, go ahead, Ray.
He's responsible for among my favorite paintings at the DIA. So Sloan was born outside Philadelphia in 1871, and he was a self-taught young artist who learned how to make etchings and drawings and sketches, and he was actually good enough to be able to sell them, even though he had no training whatsoever. In the end, he became a renowned printmaker and draftsman, and the DIA has many, many of his etchings. He began to study art in 1892 at the Philadelphia Academy of Arts, And he also worked as an illustrator. You were mentioning that, Howard, that some of them are illustrators. He was an illustrator for the Philadelphia newspapers. In Philadelphia, Sloan met Robert Henri, and so began a lifelong friendship. Next slide, please. This is Sloan's depiction of Henri in 1902. You can see the similarities that we've seen from other pictures. Now, through Henri's influence, Sloan also met Luke's, who we just saw, Shinn, who we're going to see next, and William Gladstone's, who I hope we'll get to. He was encouraged by Henri in 1897 to begin painting, but painting urban or city life. And in 1904, Sloan followed Henri to New York City. Next slide, please. Here's a wonderful drawing / caricature of John Sloan done by William Anthony, also in the DIA's collection. In 1908, as we have just mentioned, Sloan participated in the Macbeth Gallery exhibit as part of the 8. And he painted the definitive Ashcan images. And we're going to see this particular painting now, which is it's an extraordinary painting. And then the next painting is perhaps the best known painting of the Ashcan period. So this is called Wake of the Fairy, #1. It's from 1907. It's about 32 inches tall and about 38 inches wide. It's oil on canvas. Now, Sloan's paintings were generally not deep in sentimentality or emotion, but this particular painting is the exception. It evokes a sense of melancholy that arises as sort of a significant emotional response to it. Here you have these subdued harmonies of grays and browns. Then Howard, you've got those rolling masses of clouds in the background, and the tossing of the white foam and the diagonals. I'm hoping that those show up. They show up, yeah, the diagonal rain, exactly. The rain is slashing across the canvas. So you have these muted colors that convey melancholy and the dampness of a gray, misty day. Yeah, which he primarily achieves through the use of bluish and grayish gray tones. In addition to feeling melancholy, there's this sort of sense of isolation and abandonment. But you look at the woman's posture in the corner like that as she gazes down at the water. And then you have this geometric framework, which has complex horizontals and verticals with the overhang and the supports and the edge of the deck, and then even the way the gate is placed. All those elements, enhance this sort of loneliness, this sort of sense of loneliness. But at the same time, Howard, doesn't it seem like it's moving? I mean, don't you get the impression of the fairy churning through the water as it moves on? Now, this is #1, Wake of the Fairy #1. He did a second painting later, which is much less melancholy and has more distance vantage point. That's in the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. But this particular painting is thought to be an autobiographical. And the subject is Sloan's wife, Dolly, whom he married in 1901. As Sloan details in his diary, Dolly suffered from alcoholism and mental instability, and they had a difficult and complicated relationship. In fact, Howard, Sloan damaged this painting in a fight with Dolly. Years later, Sloan's friend and patron, Amelia White, talked Sloan into repairing the painting, and she thereafter bought it and eventually donated it to the DIA. Now, our curator of American art, Ken Myers, indicates that this painting is of Sloan accompanying Dolly on one of her trips to the sanitarium. Sanitariums were a kind of hospital for those suffering from mental illness and addiction. And here she is on her way to the sanitarium. Notice the woman contemplating the turbulence of the water behind the ferry, which seems to communicate Dolly's turbulent past and her own personal despair. But there's more of a universality to this. You have that loneliness of the suffering of the human spirit. I really think this is an extraordinary painting.
So Ray, this is, as you said, quintessential Ashcan that supports Henri's theory that any subject is a subject for a painting, even one as personal and painful as you taking your wife to a sanitarium for treatment for alcoholism.
And mental illness too. So it's really a, having someone go through that and, and taking them to those kinds of places is obviously extremely difficult and explains the melancholiness of the painting.
Yeah, it's like Memoirs of Today, talking about pain and suffering and what people have to go through, and being able to open things up. I think that was some of the beginning, rather than just painting, these beautiful scenes or these historic scenes or gorgeous landscapes or whatever.
Exactly. Let's go to the next painting. There it is. The iconic Ashcan painting, the best known Ashcan painting. This is Mcsorley's bar from 1912. And the DIA is fortunate to have this particular painting in its collection. Sloan did 5 of these paintings about Mcsorley's bar. This is the second composition and is arguably the best in the series. Next slide, please. So this is a photo that was taken either 20 or 30 years later. And it looks very much the same as the painting. So not much has changed in Mcsorley's. And it's interesting that this particular photograph was taken by a woman, Bernice Abbott, because at that particular time, in fact, for years, only men were allowed at Mcsorley's. And it wasn't until 1970, even though Mcsorley's was founded in 1854, it wasn't until 1970 that women were allowed or permitted access to Mcsorley's. It is a landmark tavern, and it's still in its original location in New York City, and apparently it still looks like a dive. I understand even today. Sloan's studio was close by, and he often stopped by this neighborhood saloon, and he found the range of humanity fascinating. Years later, in 1939, Sloan said of Mcsorley's that it was, quote, a favorite out-of-the-way retreat for appreciative ale drinkers. Behind its dust-covered front window and ancient bar, sawdust-covered floor, walls crowded with theater and sport prints and programs, it survived almost alone the modernization of the saloon. Next slide, please. So this painting, Howard, is a celebration of companionship and attests to something that you were just talking about a little bit. Sloan's conviction and other Ashcan painters' conviction that a real artist finds beauty in common things, everyday things. Here you have sort of a sense of camaraderie. Now, Sloan did shorthand sketches of the bar, or after his visits, he would do shorthand sketches from his memory about the bar. And although this painting has a sense of spontaneity, Sloan did a number of preparatory drawings to plan the composition. He has precisely planned gestures and expressions of the subject matters, and they're carefully posed and delineated. And the light, Howard, that seems to come down from the center is the highlight and really is the focus of the painting. And it creates, I guess, a nucleus of the composition that sort of enhances this sense of camaraderie. And at the center, Howard, is Bill Mcsorley. He's the son of the founder, and he's tending bar. And you have this kind of delicate relationship with the bartender looking down to make the drinks and the waiter who watches him in his effort. There are a lot of wonderful details in the painting, such as the overhead lights and the wall hangings, which include these yellowed bills and programs. Sloan's later paintings of Mcsorley's are much more elaborate, with a lot more figures and a broader view of the area, the saloon. But the DAI's painting, in contrast, has this quiet, intimate tone that makes it so beloved. Christine, any questions?
Actually, there is one. One of our participants was asking about the Wake of the Ferry and whether you know if the DIA has cleaned that one or not.
I don't know the restoration of it. I will say that, and you know this, Christine, the painting in person, when you have a chance to see it, is much more vibrant. The colors are much more vibrant in person.
Mm-hmm. And it's, I believe it's on view right now. I think
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Okay,
It's
thank
in the
you.
same room as Mcsorley's.
Okay, thank you.
Howard?
Ray, look, Ray, it's Mark Twain.
Oh, I thought it was you for a second.
No, that's Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens. So, and Mark Twain was not alive in 1951. Note the date this was done. And it was done by Everett Shinn. So Everett Shinn was old when he did this. He actually passed away 2 years later in 1953. So Everett Shinn, another newspaper man, another illustrator, another guy that worked at the Philadelphia newspapers, another guy who took art classes at the Pennsylvania Fine Arts. He met all these people that we've been talking about, Lukes and Glackens, who we may get to. Henri was his instructor. Eventually, he became one of the 8. He did later. He did illustrations for Harper's Weekly and McClure's, using subjects like the woman with macaw that we saw earlier. He did fashionable crowds and operas, and he later painted murals, panels, and worked as a set designer for theaters, and worked as an art director on Hollywood movies. He has a credit for a motion picture called Polly of the Circus in 1917 that was done by Samuel Goldwyn. And if you go to Internet Movie Database, IMDb, you can find him in all his credits that he did while he was working on movies. But let's talk about the Mark Twain piece. So could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So in 1903, Everett Sloan was invited to Mark Twain's studio. He met Mark Twain in New York at his home. He did lots of sketches at him. They talked, they hung out, and he did this piece, which is not our piece. It was, right now it's from courtesy of Sotheby's, but you can see that he did this piece in pastels and in graphite. So let's go to the next slide. And now this is our piece. Our piece was done in he got out his, I'm not sure why he did this, but he felt like he wanted to go back to some of the things he had done way earlier, 50 years earlier. And so he used, and I'm going to list all the media in this piece. Watercolor, gouache, ink, graphite, pencil. It's on paper. It's small. It's 10 1/4 by 13 3/4. It's not on view. It's part of our over $30,000 print collection that Claire Rogan, our
You mean
wonderful
30,000 items?
Items. Thank you, Ray.
Yeah.
Our wonderful curator who shared some information about this with us. He made these sketches of Mark Twain. He wrote on the inscription at his studio about 1903. And you can see there's Mark. He's at his desk strewn with papers. Behind him are shelves lined with books. He's got a cigar going, and he's looking at some manuscript. What is this manuscript? He used to write. He used to receive fan mail. He used to receive mail from heads of state. He used to write to heads of state. Could it be that he's reading or writing some fan mail? Could it be a new story he's writing? It's an artist at his work. That's what Shinn was representing. Let's go to the next piece. And
I
let's
love this piece. It's a
yeah,
great
let's
piece.
look at this piece closely. This also is a Conte crayon drawing. It's a chalk. Well, let's go out to the Bastille piece. Wait, let me get some information. Sorry. This is pastel charcoal, black ink, and brush. And it's a paper mounted on a thick support. It's 20 inches by 12 inches, and we got it by 1943 from the Founders Society purchased Dexter Ferry's Fund. So it's called Bastille Day. And those of us know that Bastille Day is the celebration of the French Revolution, and it's filled with fireworks and celebrations and parties and parades, just like the 4th of July. But what do we see here? Could we point to the single firework way at the top of the screen? That's it. That's the whole celebration. This is really dark with one illumination in an upper floor with a woman with her hands over her head. And down below, it appears like it's a pub of some sort with people surrounding it, quietly having their drinks. There's men and women. Our curator, Claire Rogan, tells us that this is Everett Shinn's kind of homage to the Impressionists, to the French Impressionists. So he's got it in sections. There's the section of the celebration, and then the woman in the window is like Degas, ballerinas, models, and the woman down below could be any sort of Impressionist paintings. So he was doing this on paper with pastel, with charcoal, to create an illusion of what Impressionism was, or Ashcan art in America in 1905. Interesting piece that we have, and we're lucky to have it. Unfortunately, it's not always on display, and it's not on display right now because these pieces on paper, these pieces done with gouache or watercolor are very sensitive. And so we have to conserve them and protect them for future study, for future viewing, for future people. Christine, are there any questions?
There is one question in regard, and I think it's about Everett Shinn in general. And there's texture, seems to be texture in his paintings, and almost like costume design or scene design or scene sets. Do you see that in his work?
Yeah, he was, as we said, art director for motion pictures. So he had that kind of theatrical aesthetic that he used. So yeah, this could be a scene, a storyboard for what could be a stage play or what could be a motion picture that you could use. He was that kind of artist that did those sorts of things. Complicated, interesting, tells a story.
So he was also a set designer.
He was a set designer. He was an art director. He did mural panels. He did set designs for theaters, for Broadway theaters, and he was an art director for motion pictures.
Well, our viewers seem to pick that up in his work.
Well, we have some sophisticated viewers.
Yeah, we do.
We do.
All right, Ray, I think you're up next.
I am next. This is Jonas Lai, and this is called Colibra Cut. It's from 1913, and through the efforts of Clyde Bellows again, the DIA purchases painting directly from the artist after it was shown at the DIA in an exhibition. Next slide, please. He was Norwegian born. His father was Norwegian, but his mother was American. And his father died at 12 years old, so he was sent to America, and he eventually ended up in New York City, and he studied at the National Academy. And he was so talented that at 20 years old, they began to exhibit his work. His specialty was landscapes, and he traveled extensively and painted the places he visited, for instance, in the Americas and in Europe. And during his career, he won many, many prestigious art awards. Next slide, please. Now, Lai is not officially counted among the Ashcan artists, mainly because his work did not center on daily life in New York City. But he is associated with the Ashcan genre because his works share the same characteristics of those artists. You have those richly painted surfaces, of brush strokes and layers of strong contrast of colors. You've got the distinctive treatment of light and color and the emphasis on harmony, and you have the realism of daily life or daily scene. Now, this painting belongs to a group of 30 large-scale paintings that Lai did, which gained him distinction as the interpreter of the construction of the Panama Canal. Briefly, in 1904, the French abandoned doing the Panama Canal because it was too many difficulties and too much challenges. And so the United States took over, and 10 years later, they opened up the Panama Canal. Now, Lai visited the canal in 1913 and remained in the region for 3 months, producing all these exceptional images of the canal under the construction. These works are also a dramatic illustration of the growing American industrial power and its projection of that power beyond its borders. The painting is one of the largest and most compelling of Lai's images of the canal. So the painting is of the excavation of the Colabra Cut, which is the name of the mountain range, and the cut is an artificial valley that cuts through the Continental Divide and formed part of the Panama Canal. Lai uses these richly varied palette of smoky blues and grays, to produce this, I don't know, Howard, like a bold, and you've got these center points and contrasting with these white, clouds and yellows and the distinct mountains, all billowing smoke. So it's a dramatic sense of proportion and perspective and movement. It's a rugged landscape, and when you see it in the gallery, it's in the same gallery as these other Ashcan paintings that we've been just talking about. It really is very captivating. Even though it's rugged and it's got these train tracks and it's spewing smoke, and you got workmen in this cleft, carved out of the mountains. It's really interesting because it depicts an industrial scene of men and machine, in reality, devastating nature's landscape. But the composition and its colors is pleasingly captivating. There's something about the composition, these colors, these blues, these grays, and the perspective that make it pleasingly captivating. And it's of a common subject matter, but beautifully done. Common, but beautiful. Howard, first of all, Christine, do we have any questions?
We don't, Ray.
Okay. Howard, I don't know if you have time for the next piece.
Yeah, I think we can do the next one.
Okay, great.
We could do this. Ray, does this look like an Ashcan painting to you?
Not at all. It looks like a French Impressionist paint.
So there you go. So William Platkins, get this, Ray, what a surprise. Philadelphia reporter and illustrator.
Where have I heard that before?
I don't know. Trained with Sloan, Luke, Shinn, Henri. He loved Edouard Manet, but he really loved Renoir. And remember, Henri said, anything is a subject. So it doesn't have to be a street urchin kind of gritty scene. And this is a guy who eventually moves his style onward. This is done in 1927 when he's later in his life. It's an oil painting. It was purchased by the city of Detroit in 1930. It, Burroughs again, right, Ray? It was 32 inches by 25 inches. And it's really less an example of blunt realism and way more impressionistic. Look at the feathered kind of brushwork and the heightened colors. Ray, you were talking about color theory before. So look at us how, not to be technical, but complementary colors are two different colors on opposite the color wheel. So red and green are complementary. And then you put the red and green next to each other and you use really soft modeling and soft edges, not hard edges, and you get a painting that shimmers. Could we go to the next slide, please? Look at Renoir's Woman in an Armchair. Look at how soft and and shimmery that is. Now let's go to the next slide and look back at this. Same. And this is, the girl is named Lena. She's Glackens' daughter. The family was vacationing in France when a neighbor secured this donkey. Glackens made lots of sketches of her. And then in the studio, he did a number of different oils. So in our piece, we have her really front and center, really right in the front of the picture frame, similar to all those paintings in our Baroque gallery. And she fills it right up. And you can only see a small marginal glimpse of the background. And that heightened red and that complementary green and the feathering and shimmering borders gives you just a glowing reliance on this impressionistic / expressionistic style. So you can see that this is a good way to end this talk, because this is, you can see how our artists have evolved from their piece. So Ray, it was good working with you today. You want to close us out, buddy?
Oh, sure I do. And thank you everyone for attending today. We really appreciate your patronage. Next week on Thursdays at the Museum, Howard and I's colleagues, docent colleagues, Kathleen McBroom and Debbie Coons, are going to be presenting, we call it Essentials. It's like the greatest hits of the DIA, and they're going to cover a lot of them in a fun format. So we encourage you to tune in again next week. Until then, stay safe, and thank you so much.